Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to It's Not in the Writer's Manual, a Q&A session for new writers. Before we begin, a couple of reminders. If you could fill out your evaluations, that would be super helpful. And if you don't have your phones muted, please go ahead and do that so we don't have any extra sounds. We are so glad that you are here because if you were not here, we would not have this session. This is completely crowdsourced. We're going to be talking about what you want to be talking about, whether you are already in the industry, you're looking to get in, or maybe you want to work with narrative designers and game writers. So in a few minutes, I'm going to invite you to come up to either mic and ask your questions. But before that, my esteemed panelists and I are going to introduce ourselves, and I will start. My name is Toya Kristen Findley. I am a writer and editor in general. I have been a freelancer my entire adult life in video games. I wear a lot of narrative hats. I am a game writer, a narrative designer, an editor, and a consultant. I am also a game designer. I have worked on everything from AAA to mobile to indie to kids games. I have recently worked on Destiny 2, the mobile game Insecure the Come-Up game, as well as the indie game Slave Zero X. I have also published several books, including the Game Narrative Toolbox, which I co-authored, Freelance Video Game Writing, The Life and Business of the Digital Mercenary for Hire, and Branching Story, Unlocked Dialogue, Designing and Writing Visual Novels.
Oh, me next? Hi, I guess I will go next. Hi, my name is Michelle Clough. I am a game writer, editor, and narrative designer with the narrative co-op Tailspinner. So we do narrative outsourcing for various clients and companies and games. I've been working as a freelancer in the game industry for, I want to say 10 years, but about only like since 2019 have I been doing it full time. I have also worked on everything from like AAA to mobile to indie games. I also actually did editing work for Destiny 2. I also talk a lot about romance and sex in video games, and I end up giving a lot of talks at GDCs about the topic. And I wrote a book about the topic about designing sex in games. And run a few organizations to do with that. And other than that, I basically just show up and be like, wow, Toya's awesome. I should be like Toya when I grow up.
Is it my turn now?
Yeah.
Sorry. Sorry I'm late. There's like a lot of people out there. Like I had a panel this morning and seemingly the attendance in GDC doubled in that time. Anyway, hello, my name is Evan Narcissus. I'm currently the senior writer at Brassline Entertainment, where I'm working on a thing I can't talk about. What am I allowed to say? What's up? If that's a colleague, thank you. What am I allowed to say? We're an anime-influenced third-person action RPG. What else? How did I get here? I like to call myself a journalist in recovery. I transitioned to writing comics, which led to working in games and animation. I've written Rise of the Black Panther for Marvel Comics. For DC, I've done a number of projects, including the Milestone Media 30th Anniversary Special, Batman, Gotham Knights Gilded City. In games, I've worked on the Miles Morales game with the folks at Insomniac. I contributed to the War for Wakanda expansion for Marvel's Avengers, and did some consulting on Gotham Knights. And I think that's everything y'all need to know. Yeah, let's start the panel.
I'm Emily Short. I'm a freelance narrative designer at the moment, working on a AAA project. Immediately previous to that, I spent several years as a creative director at Fail Better Games, which does indie, very narrative-focused, very British games such as Fallen London, Sunless Skies, and Sunless Sea. And before that, I've done a number of things kind of with experimental AI projects to not sort of in the current mode of generative AI, but sort of older forms of AI to drive character interaction. So I'm very interested in not only kind of how are we writing characters, how are we designing our sort of moment-to-moment gameplay, but also narrative systems and the underlying engineering and tech.
Hi, my name is Nessa Cannon. I'm a games writer and narrative designer. I've been in the industry for about 4 years-ish. I work primarily on indie projects such as Waves of Steel and Endoparasitic and Only Cans and Star Trucker, which is coming out soon. Thanks. I work primarily in the indie space, but I've done some stuff in AAA that I can't talk about. And I really have a passion for branching narrative. I really cut my teeth on Twine. I'm doing a talk on branching narrative later. But yeah, freelance, branching, indie, woo.
Hello, my name is Adana Ned. I'm a games writer and narrative designer. I've been in the industry for about 3-ish years. I'm currently writing for Spirit Swap, Lo-Fi Beats to Match 3-2, which you can wishlist on Steam right now. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And I've also worked on some other AAA projects I can't talk about, and I've also done some games research, specifically looking on how players of color interact in virtual environments. And I'm also doing a fun talk on creating love interest after this. So if you want to add a hot vampire to your game, come to my talk.
And please come up and ask your questions.
Hi. Okay. Just wanted to make sure I was a good distance from the mic. I transitioned from being an English creative writing major into my last semester and realizing that I wanted to write for games. Were there any elements that y'all find coming from writing prose to writing games, that any rules or elements of writing prose that should be kind of thrown away when when trying to write for games?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about this. I talked about it in my previous talk. Games are different than prose media with respect to the fact that people are showing up for a different kind of experiential texture. When you're reading a novel or even a graphic novel, comics are different because the text and the pictures are supposed to work together when it's well done. But in games, people are showing up from mostly mechanical experiences, right? So like, what does this button press do? Where does this jump take me, right? And your words can kind of support and undergird all of that, but they are not the star of the show. Like when you come from a prose writing background, for me it was journalism. But if you're like a novelist or somebody who writes with text as your primary delivery platform, like your text is going to have to be short, tight, impactful. And depending on the design of your game, like you might have to reckon with the fact that players are skipping past dialogue boxes or not reading all the lore that drops. So all the stuff where you're like, yeah, I'm getting my words in here. And they're like, yeah, next. So one of the things that you need to really think about when you're doing narrative design in games is one, thinking about a multidisciplinary approach, right? So the words that you might want to get, the ideas and plot beats that you might want to get through character dialogue, you might have to embed somewhere else, right? Maybe there's ambient NPCs reacting to state changes, and that's a storytelling vector. The set decoration that your artist will put on the walls or whatever. Like we all laugh about environmental storytelling where it's like dead inside, don't open graffiti on the door, but like that's a storytelling vector, and you as a narrative designer should not be backing away from those opportunities. You should be leaning into them. So that's going to mean talking with your level designers, your art team, your audio team about, hey, what are the different tools that we're going to have at our disposal to tell this story? It's not going to just be like, and then he said this to her. It might just be like, overhearing a conversation and catching snatches like that. You're going to have to modulate your approach when you're writing for games. I'm sorry if I just talked too long, everybody.
No, it's great. I think the one thing that I would add to that is that because the prose in the games is so load-bearing, the players are really looking to it to give them a lot of clues about what to do next and how to interact with it. You can accidentally make promises to players or say things that they think are going to be a promise. So something that might, if you're writing a fantasy novel, you might include these sort of cool little offhand details that you think, that just sounds great, I'm just going to throw that in there. If you're not careful in a game context, that players can read those things as, I'm definitely going to meet this character, this thing that you just referred to is definitely going to happen down the line. So you've got to be a lot more sort of careful and precise about, like, what am I committing to by putting this in here?
Hi, I'm a college dropout. I'm sorry that you're college. The biggest thing that I found when I was transitioning from prose to interactive fiction writing that I think gets left behind in a lot of teaching courses about it is how important pacing is, and how writing prose, the sense of pacing is just so different to anything that you'll write in games, in my opinion. Even interactive fiction, even like text-based, the amount of text that a player can handle at once is so much lower than a prose page or a blog post or anything like that. And so I think really finding, not necessarily leaving what you've left behind about pacing in prose, but really understanding what it means within the interactive medium and how much you can throw at a player, like what bite-sized portions of your work fits at once, as opposed to be like, writing a book all at once or whatever. That's one of the things that I put out there all the time, is that pacing is everything. So
I am also a creative writing major who wrote prose fiction and came to games and still do the prose fiction. But the most important thing and how you're going to have to rethink your role as a writer is that when you are writing prose, when you are telling a story, the audience is coming to you because they are interested in the story that you have to tell. When you're writing for a game or doing the narrative design for the game, they don't care about your story. They're telling their story. And you are a facilitator to help them tell their story. And Evan talked about all of the things that we don't usually traditionally think of as story, like the environment and the ambiance and the sound design and all of that. All of that is also story. But so is the gameplay itself and what players can do in the game. So the story itself is undergirding all of that. And so that's how you really have to kind of retweak and think about who you are as a writer. It's, I have an audience versus I am helping the player.
And apparently the word of this panel is going to be undergirded, so write that down.
I just wanted to add on to things both Evan and Toya said, that for me, the two main differences, well, there are many differences, but one of them is the aspect of player agency and the player being the hero. Like when you're writing prose, you can just say, the hero does this because of blah, blah, blah character development or blah, 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 reasoning. In the game, you have to give, the player may not want to do that. The player is the one who decides to walk across the room, and just sort of wrestling control from them and making them do it is not always feasible or desirable. So you have to think almost in terms of not just what is my character's motivation, but what is the player's motivation to do things. And secondly, building specifically on what Evan was saying about it being interdisciplinary, if I'm writing prose, I can say, she looked out over a crowd of 10,000 people, and cool, that group of 10,000 people now exists. If I write, she looks out over a crowd of 10,000 people for a video game, I'm going to get a very angry message from various departments being like, do you know how much extra work you've just made for us? So there's very much an element of, and things that we take for, that, you can take for granted in prose or even in film that, who was the person who was talking about for the purse example? That somebody put something in her purse and 15 departments blew up and was like, oh my God, And so having an understanding that the things that you write visually can actually make for a lot of work and be a lot more difficult to do than you might expect.
I wanted to add on, similar to Michelle's point, when you're writing for games, you often have to keep in mind the necessities that other teams have, like the artist can't make 10,000, but it's also going to come back on you, where it's we only have space for one boss fight in this game, and you need to do all of the narrative climactic stuff in this one boss fight. So being aware of all the different constraints you'll have to do, and even if it doesn't serve the story the way you want it, it still needs to serve the player in the game.
I think there is also one other thing that I sort of feel is quite, well, maybe not exactly unique, but imagine writing prose when suddenly your editor comes in and is like, for budget reasons, we have cut chapters 2 to 5. You've got a day to make the rewrites and make chapters 1 to 6 actually connect with each other and still make sense. Go.
Awesome. Thank y'all so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Hello. A question I have is, what is either the most unexpected skill or thing you had to do that you would have never expected going into being a game writer. So either something you had to learn that you just never thought would be in your toolbox, or just something really, I don't know, either incredible or hilarious that you had to end up facing in this profession.
I'll jump on that one first. Understanding the people you're working with, their communication and reading styles, because all brains learn differently, and you sometimes have to tweak how you're communicating with people so that they can understand you. And I've had to do that on several different projects. I worked with an artist who didn't like certain types of references because it messed with the way they were able to conceptualize certain things. And so I had to learn, don't give him those types of references. And one of the very first things that I like to do when I'm first sending off like a major thing of documentation is I ask specifically, please let me know if anything does not make sense. Also, like in one-on-one conversations, I want to make sure that we're on the same page, because if you are not, things can fester, things could be misunderstood for months. That's not unusual. So when you're working with people, really understand how they like to learn, understand that all brains are different, and that's okay.
Yeah, I'll just add to what Toya just said. You know, I work with designers who, hey, guess what? My ministry is flowcharts, and you're about to get baptized in that ministry. Like, here's a flowchart for this, here's a flowchart for that. You know, especially because games are such an intensely visual medium, you often wind up working with designers who think, okay, in terms of like graphical design rather than like, you know, big old chunks of text like probably most of us do. You know, my more direct answer to your question is like spreadsheets. Like, I never thought I was going to spend so much time in Excel or equivalent programs in my life, but yes, it's like the kind of software engagement that I avoided my whole life has now showed up. It's like, guess what? You're about to learn today. That's what Excel sounds like, by the way. But yeah, so like, you know, charting out a player's arc across different state changes, across, you know, different plot beats, then how does the world react? Like, you're going to have to visually map that out some way for your collaborators. You know, like my talk today was about comics to games adaptations, and one thing that's common about both media is that, like, you as the writer, like we've been saying, like writing can be a support role depending on, you know, the paradigms that you're working in. Like, certain projects will be, hey, we're going to give you, you're going to give us the ideas and we're going to execute and we're going to collaborate and figure out what the scope is. And other projects will be like, hey, guess what? We have all the ideas and you're going to polish them and shine them up and create narrative connective tissue. So the paradigms are different. And I say all that to say as preamble to a quote that Kieran Gillen, comics writer, game maker, overall good guy, good taste in shoes. He said a long time ago that a comic script is basically a document to excite the artist, right? When you're writing, you have to get everything aligned in such a way, the scene descriptions, facial expressions, descriptions, like, you know, the flow of events on a page, all that is here, you give this to the artist now, you make it come to life, right? And narrative design is very much the same way, right? You know, sometimes you're already getting the building blocks and being asked to energize them, but sometimes you have to come up with the building blocks. So, like, knowing that your documentation is part of a collaborative process. I'll probably wind up repeating this over and over again, but like, it's really key. Like, you're not working alone here, and other people are implementing whatever you put on the page and the screen, flowchart, Microsoft Excel, whatever.
So for me, one of the things I did that I had no idea I would be doing in games writing was voice direction and making voice briefs for voice actors, because for Spirit Swap, we did have a voice director, but they also needed someone to explain them what are the story, what are the characters, and like help advise actors during recording sessions. So as a games writer, you're going to be the source of truth for all the narrative stuff, and it's not just the voice acting team that might reach out to you. It might be the design team, because they're trying to figure out what's the best way that this level should look to fit the story. So being able to like know the ins and outs of your story and how that's going to affect other disciplines is really, really important.
I think for me, the thing is, because a lot of interesting narrative work happens in the indie space in very small studios, I also needed to learn a whole bunch of extra business things that I had never anticipated. They're not related, in my mind, to games writing at all. So pitching, talking to investors, writing marketing content, just kind of dealing with the realities of potentially helping to run a company. And those are things that, depending on kind of the direction of your game writing career, might not be relevant at all. But if you're going into the indie space, often you find, you're partly doing your game job and you're partly doing the job of just keeping this whole project going and making it happen. And that kind of can entail a lot of extra external skills that aren't necessarily obvious. So.
I just want to piggyback off of what everybody said about soft skills and how, for me, one of the things that I've used the most is, this is going to sound weird. I used to work with kids as a youth chess coach, and which was a very weird job. But sometimes I remember certain skills in the way of speaking to, especially freelance clients who come in and are like, I played Baldur's Gate 3 last night. I have some ideas. It's like, well, hang on. And getting to the bottom of like, okay, what did you like about it? What do you really want to pull from this? Because you don't want to make Baldur's Gate 4, I'm telling you. That's not what you're doing. But like getting to the bottom of what people want in a way that feels very collaborative and very kind is something that I find myself doing way more than I thought I would do. But my fun answer is that I'm fluent in CB radio speak, and I never thought I'd have to do that. So.
And for me, I guess there's sort of two short ones. One of them, I always knew going into the industry that like brevity was going to be an issue, and that's still a work in progress. But more specifically, what I didn't realize how much of it was actually things like character length of a line, because that's a very specific one, because you've got to work out like what will fit in text boxes. And luckily I had some experience doing closed captioning and subtitling, so that was a reasonably easy adjustment. But that is something I think a lot of writers, maybe new writers might not think of in terms of, that like not just being brief, but also making sure things fit in the dialogue box. The other is, I guess, really sort of having to dig down into our creative ability to ask, like, what if, and specifically turn it to, what if the player does this? Because very many times I've had a thing where it's like, oh, it's a cut, it's a sort of a gameplay-ish sequence, and then the player will do this, and I've had to be like, no. They might not do that. They might try and shoot this thing or do this other thing, and having to talk with clients about, how do we handle those edge cases? Is there a different way we could tell the story? Is there a way we could, redirect, or, does this need to be a cutscene rather than gameplay? Things like that. I think, like, you spend a lot of time doing that, I think, as a game writer as well.
Perfect. Good afternoon. I was wondering if you can share strategies to structure and organize personal narrative design pipeline to support high agency emergent narrative via aggregate meaning, where story is a dynamic property of the game mechanics rather than pre-authored content.
If I'm understanding your question correctly, you're talking about...
So how do you structure your personal narrative design pipeline in order to effectively deliver in the high agency system that infers from the player intent rather than through embedded meaning where you ask the player to branch the narrative at specific points?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I understand your question. And, my first, gut reaction to the question is that, like, the tools aren't there yet, right? I personally am skeptical about how the integration of LLM systems are going to work with authored narratives. I know Ubisoft just announced something this morning. I haven't watched it, so congrats to them, I guess. But, I think one of the things that is probably going to still be true for human writers, typing with their human fingers on keyboards, is that we're going to need to be the people to figure out what the buckets are, right? When you're thinking about choice-heavy narratives and things that have a lot of branching, you're going to need to think about what the possibility spaces are, how to connect through the rest of your narratives, and I guess the people who are looking to implement these systems and game creation pipelines will have to figure out what can be automated, what not. I personally hope none of it gets automated, but whatever. I'll call me naive, but I think the thing is, like, you're still going to need human agency and human interaction and design, and intuition, most importantly, about what the story is, right? Like, I think one of the things that is distressing about, the encroachment of AI and LLMs in creative industries is that, like, hey, human-to-human communication is still a very, like, specific skill that you develop. Just because we can all talk and read doesn't mean, like, we can all tell stories. And determining what your story is, I think, is still going to be need to be a human-centric paradigm. But,
Thank you.
So I absolutely do not disagree with the sort of core point of telling stories is a really important human endeavor, and it's something, this is like cultural work that we are doing, as well as product creation. So I agree with all of that. And if it's okay to kind of pivot to a much more technical answer, if I've understood kind of what you're getting at, you're talking about sort of situations where you want the story to be, the story of the game to be adapting very strongly to the player's indications of what parts of the story are they interested in, what do they want their character to do in this space, and so on. And so from my point of view, that is very much sort of starting from how do we understand the world state of what's possible in this game. So we're not just, like, if we're creating that kind of game, we're not just creating here's a linear narrative or here's even a branching narrative, but we're creating an entire sort of world story space in which things can happen. So I tend to approach that by thinking about, let me kind of map out the state space that matters, like the kinds of stats that might matter, the kinds of possibilities that might matter. That maybe it's relationships between characters, maybe I'm looking at, the strength of a particular kingdom, whatever it is that I'm dealing with there, and then start to think about what kinds of story moments that fit this kind of game could map to those different world states, and kind of build out that mapping and start to identify, like, which bits, like which moments here in this world space map are interesting, and how can we kind of encourage the player to play towards those and experience those, and which are actually kind of boring, and how do we kind of steer people away. And there's a whole lot else that goes into that, but a lot of it is about that very kind of space-oriented rather than linear-oriented approach to graphing and thinking about it.
Right, exactly what I was had in mind. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for being here today. I currently work at a studio that is focused and has a big talent pool of writers that specialize in non-narrative comedy writing. And both myself, from a career standpoint, and the studio are looking into branching into narrative. The thing is, we don't know where to start. We don't even know where to begin to even where the industry is, what we need to do. So I was wondering if there was just like individual, like good first steps for people who are trying, like have games experience, but are trying to start that game narrative career.
Man, wow. Good first steps. There's been a couple of times where I've been asked to submit for projects that are in development, and there's been one or two times where, like, here's our character art, write something. What do you think this character is all about? You got 150 words, go. So depending, I think one of the things that undergirds all our insights about this industry is, like, it depends on the project first, right? Like, is this a hero shooter where you're going to be writing one of multiple characters? Then what's the whole cast, right? Like, what's the breakdown in terms of socioeconomic statuses, like their backgrounds? Do they interlace or not? Are they all separate? Like, is it an open world thing? Is it just a linear story? Is it a visual novel? So, like, knowing what you're going to need to bring to the table about the kind of games that a studio or a team might be making, like, is the first step, right? So then the work you can do by yourself is like, okay, it's a hero shooter. Let me come up with, like, character profiles for, like, 5 or 6 characters, Like, that's work you can be doing to workshop your own skills outside of any potential assignments, right? But I think, figuring out, hey, if I'm going to jump into this discipline, like, what are the things I'm going to need to know project to project, and how can I work on my own skills aside from any kind of potential work, so that you're ready, right? You know, again, I keep on making these metaphors to comics because that's another medium that I work in. But like at the big comics publishers, they're not going to train you up. They want to know that you can do the job already, right? Like they want to know that you know how to tell a story, and they're not going to have to hold your hand because they have other production schedules that they need to think about. And I think the same thing is probably much very true for games. Like working on your craft. So like we've all been talking about, bite-sized information delivery, right? You know, how do you sketch out character texture like in succinct ways, right? You know, sometimes all you may get to deliver insight into who a character is like 2 lines of dialogue. Can you do that, right? Is it memorable? And then thinking about the other storytelling vectors in games as a multidisciplinary craft, right? So like, hey, if I'm not necessarily writing long reams of text, how else can I help my collaborative partners tell the story? Y'all really got to stop me from talking. Like, just be like, okay.
I was going to jump in over here.
Seconding what Evan mentioned about how figuring out what type of game you want first and what type of mechanics, because I heard you mention that it's a lot of comedy writers that aren't in games, and I actually know of a game, cannot remember the name, but it's about a clam that does stand-up, and depending on what the player responds with, that affects the mood of the crowd, how much tips they make, whether they can progress on to the next part of the story. So knowing like what your team skill set is and how that's going to relate to the mechanics that you can make in the game is very important, in addition to learning all the other wonderful, wonderful things about making games. But for other resources, I have a games narrative resource sheet, and I definitely recommend Emily's blog on narrative design. It's really, really good. It's what I used when I started. Highly recommended.
Everybody has given such great answers. I think on an individual level, if you have a handful of comedy writers who have never written games, the recommendation that I give to anybody who has written before but hasn't written games is to open up Twine and mess around. And that's what I would recommend, especially for comedy writers, because comedy, I hate to be like pacing again, but comedy is really good pacing, right? And so if they can get into a game engine where they can see immediate input and see, you know, how they can do little branching and how they can do little pacing and stuff, that's really, really vital to building confidence and also introducing the idea of like, here are the ways that we can make outcomes, and giving a feel for like having to write the same thing twice or the same outcome of things. And it's just really good, like that's where I would start. If I had like a room full of comedy writers, I'd be like, okay, here's Twine, go have fun for a couple of days. So that's what I would do.
I would just say they just need to understand foundational storytelling before even, you know, trying to write a story. Doesn't matter what medium you're working in. What makes for good characters? What makes a good story? What makes good world building? Because all of that is going to end up in a game in some way. So just start there. What are the foundations of good storytelling?
And I'll jump in again with one where don't be afraid that if you're really struggling or you know, maybe need that extra narrative support at the beginning, like there are often options where you can say bring in a more experienced narrative designer or game writer as a consultant to help you build some of that foundational setting and foundational work. It's like, for example, with Tail Spinners, we've had clients where we do workshops, and it will basically, clients will come with it's kind of this world, and we sort of have this idea for a hero, and something cool happens, and then there's a betrayal, and we'll be like, okay, let's take these like individual ideas you have and see if we can pull theme out of it, see if we can pull structure out of it. So there are going to be people you can reach out to that or consultants you can contract that can sometimes help you with that initial development phase and get your writing team on the right track.
I just want to interject one last thing. Start small. Do not make Baldur's Gate 4. You will be miserable. And I'd also recommend maybe checking out specifically the Jackbox games, because there are a lot of funny...
That's where I work.
Oh.
Plot twist!
Well,
Unfamiliar.
great intuition, me, but like looking at like the different games, and that's a great starting point. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Who scripted that? That was amazing.
Comedy.
I was wondering if there were any daily activities or like environmental factors that can help you come up or generate like creative ideas? Like I find I get a lot of my good ideas when I'm running and listening to music. Do y'all ever have anything like that?
Yeah,
or help you become more creative?
I was about to ask you how your brain works. I mentioned that before, and I realized a few years ago that I'm an audio-visual thinker. I literally see and hear things in my head like I'm directing scenes. And I also use music because it's like the soundtrack to the story I'm telling in my head. So my best way of being when I'm generating ideas, and this is writing, and I didn't know this at first, is I like it completely dark, late at night, where I can pace back and forth listening to music, and I'm just going over scenes over and over again, to the point that I'm even memorizing the dialogue of the characters. And I can go back like weeks later and then write things down, have like a mini summary of a scene. Maybe I'm not ready to write it yet. I think it's very important, unless you're on a deadline. Deadlines, I don't have a problem coming up with stuff, oddly. But if I'm working on something myself, I can't try to physically force myself to write. And like I said, there's the visual writing in my head and there's the physical writing. And I found that if I'm trying to physically write something when I'm not ready, it is both emotionally and physically draining for me. So I think really understanding how your brain works, it seems like music is a really good start, but you might explore a little bit more with that. I don't know if you're audiovisual or not. It seems like you're audio. That's where I'd begin.
So for me, I don't know if anyone else does this, but I need like my floor time where I like lay down in complete silence and just think about like the stories I'm trying to like make. But for finding inspiration also, I watch a lot of anime, and it's like watch things that inspire you and also watch things that are completely new. Because one of the most important things I've learned within like games writing and writing in general is that the more stories that you see and consume, the more ways you know and learn how to tell stories. Because if you just watch the same thing over and over, you'll be used to one specific type of story. But if you start expanding your horizons more, you'll see, oh, they did something really unique with the music, or they did something unique with the dialogue. So just seeing different ways things can be done can be really helpful for inspiring.
Yeah. I tend to have a very sort of analytical and verbal approach, so I tend to do a lot of background reading. So if I have a project that's in a particular setting, I'll do a lot of research about that setting or about sort of people who lived in that time or whatever that is, and that tends to kind of provide a whole bunch of material for me to recombine. And then often, you know, when I'm trying to come up with an idea, it's not just I want some idea, it's I want an idea to fix this particular problem, right? Like I'm looking for a specific type of idea. And so the other thing that I find really useful in that case is to actually write down as though I were briefing myself as a consultant, right? Like if I were hiring me and telling myself what the problem is that I'm trying to solve, write that down. And once I've got it like clearly expressed, then suddenly it becomes much more easy for me to think about.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to do +1 to everybody suggesting music and go one step further and say ambient YouTube videos, like anything where I can sort of, particularly if there's a particular theme for what it is I'm writing, I'll be like medieval lo-fi to chill out to, you know, like ambient elven castle, and or, you know, like Chrono Trigger lo-fi, and I'll just have that in the background and listen to it over and over until my brain melts. Another thing I've been doing recently, it's actually less a creative process and more a trying to keep myself productive and keep myself focused, is that I've been getting into virtual body doubling through things like Focusmates. In a shocking twist that surprises no one, I have ADHD, and sometimes getting started on writing is like pushing a boulder made of molasses uphill. Whereas when you have a bit more structure where it's like, hey, we're going to be doing a thing for an hour, and at the end of the hour, there will be a low-stakes check-in with my buddy to be like, hey, did you do the thing? Or did you work on the thing? Sometimes that helps push me through the sort of wall of awful. And sometimes what I'm coming up with is not like amazing, you know, Shakespearean stuff, but it doesn't always have to be. It's actually encouraging me to just get something down, to sort of go through the iterative process. And even if I don't finish my particular goal in a session, I'm like, oh, but I made progress. That was better than like 5 hours on Twitter and YouTube like I normally do.
This definitely won't apply to everybody. It totally depends on, like what Toya said, how your brain works. I write everything down, like everything. Like I look like that meme of Charlie Day with all the papers behind him. I have these all stick Post-it notes that are everywhere. I have notebooks and everything. I have little notes on my phone. I have a dream journal. When I got into the habit of writing everything down, I remembered everything better. And when you I'm sure that a lot of people have experienced this. Have you ever woken up and you have an idea and you're like, oh, I have an idea, and then you don't remember it 10 seconds later, or you're driving the car and you think of a really banger line and then you don't remember it when you get home? I hate that. It actually really irritates me. And so when I got into the process of writing everything down, it was really, really easy to come up with ideas because I was so used to documenting everything. Does that make sense? When you write everything down, I feel like you have a better grasp on how your brain works and where to go for sources of inspiration. And so, yeah, this is definitely not a catch-all. This probably won't work for everybody. But for me, really documenting how my brain works helps me do the stuff that I want it to do, because sometimes it's very resistant. So that's my tip, is just be insane about it.
Thank you.
So I have a story-based game that I'm working on, and it has, small branching narratives or branching paths, and then a fork in the road in the middle where the story splits. I'm wondering, how do you write this story? Because I tried doing it like a movie script at first, and then I'm like, okay, the branching paths are it's really hard to write it in one script. And then I use Twine. That seems like the way to go. But do you use Twine exclusively, or do you have multiple sources where you have the script?
I write directly into Twine, and some people think that that's crazy. But I really like it. I really like how tactile it feels, especially if you're writing really small little branches. I think that you could get away with a Microsoft table, or when we start to get into really, really big things, we start looking into spreadsheets. Spreadsheets don't feel very intuitive for me. I do them a lot when I'm working with clients, but when I'm working alone, Twine, bare bones Twine, is definitely the way that I go for tracking inputs and outputs, especially on small stuff.
Yeah, there are a number of other tools that also do this. Another one that I'm quite fond of is Ink. So that's a really nice one for writing fluidly, creating choices, and then rebranching things together. And that is available for free, so you can just go out there and get that.
My favorite tool of choice is Artisy Draft. I use Artisy Draft 3, and that one I find really good for dealing with branching, or even with linear, because it's very visual, like Twine. It's got nodes and things like that, but it also has the capacity to sort of do the CSI zoom, enhance, and you can nest nodes inside of each other, so you can start off plotting your story of just choice A, choice B, and then you can go inside that node and then actually have the scripts or maybe the minor choices within it. So it is a little bit complicated to use, and sometimes it's a little overpowered, but I do find it very useful for plotting out branching narrative, and sometimes even linear narrative where I need to worry about well, what if the player talks to this character before X plot has happened?
The only thing I'll add to everybody's kind of expert tool-based advice is a larger craft consideration, which is reverse engineer your story from the back to the front. So especially when you're dealing with something that has a lot of potential branches and pivot points and inflections, you got to know where you're going to end up to figure out how you get there, right? And I'm sorry if that sounds like basic 101 ass type advice, but starting back from the ending or endings and figuring out, okay, how do I set up the dominoes across these pathways so that when the player flicks one, it brings them to any number one of these points? I think, figuring out the old Chekhov guns theory, right? You put the gun in the first act and it has to go off in the third. Think about that third act first, right? Not to talk about guns, but who's it pointed at? Why? Who's pulling the trigger? And then you can think backwards about okay, here are the choices that brought us to this moment.
So I second Ink and Twine. They're both very useful, but even before you want to start coding, one thing I like to use is PowerPoint because I'm a very visual learner, and it's also good to start from the end to see how you get there, but PowerPoint's also useful because it's good to good to check what variables you will be using in your branching narratives to see like, okay, how will I track that the player made this choice, and is there any time later up that this can be brought up to say, oh, I remembered you made that choice, so now this happens. So having like Artistry Draft, like also like the different types of like Jira, what's the other one? Asana is also good, and Miro? Yes, Miro, that one. So being able to see like all the branches visually and like the different ways branches interact is also really helpful. And it will also make it easier on your programmers. Take care of your programmers.
Yeah, I am the programmer too, so. Thank you.
All right. So obviously narrative is not a huge field, and a lot of specialty stuff is even more narrow. So for someone who's just starting out, how do you sort of balance like developing a specialty versus like being generally employable?
I mean, play to your strengths, right? And I think part of your question is figuring out what your strengths are. And, you know, again, the kind of skill development that you can do on your own before you get an assignment or a gig is like, hey, what am I good at? You know, do I like writing character dialogue and figuring out how to sketch their personalities that way? Do I think of, you know, plot scenarios easily? Like, you know, every kind of writer is different at every kind of thing, right? So, you know, I'm currently in the middle of a personal writing project, and I have no idea how the hell I'm going to get to where I want to go. But, you know, when I do sit down, and it's like, okay, one kind of rubric I've been telling myself is like, answer a question about one of these characters every time you sit down. So it's like, okay, what was this character's childhood like? And it's me feeling around the kind of pathways of the story and figuring out what I want to do. Like, you know, I'm not one of these rigorous write every day kind of dudes, unfortunately. But, you know, despite that, you know, limitation in my mind, you can still kind of figure out, okay, experiment with what feels good and think about it, whether that's something you can specialize in.
In terms of being figuring out what you like and also being employable, Evan has a really good point of, you know, working on what you like and figuring out what you like. I think in terms of the being employable part is sorry, I'm forming my thoughts. One of the biggest pieces of advice that I give to folks who are just starting out is having a finished game, like a finished Twine game or an ink game or something, will do more for you than having like the most polished resume. Like if you have something done, even if it's small, even if it's like teeny tiny, it's picking a vision and then following it and then finishing it and then being like, hey, I'm okay with other people reading this, because that's a big part of it. And so that's like the biggest piece of advice that I could ever give you is put up an itch.io page, put up 2 Twine games that are super, super teeny tiny, like 5 minutes or less, and you would be surprised at what resonates with people, but also just how much people appreciate like being able to see your finished work, like what you consider to be something that you can show to other people.
To follow what Nessa said, I also recommend doing game jams because A, you're going to get that nice finished game you can put on your portfolio, and B, you're going to work with a team in a very tight constraints, which is what you're going to need for whenever you're working games writing. And every game jam game is going to be different. As a writer, you may need to advise artists on, okay, this is what this character looks like, or maybe you're going to get an already completed character, and you're going to need, okay, what am I going to write? What's the backstory? What's their childhood like, etc. So working with teams and realizing and learning what different disciplines need from you as a games writer and narrative designer is super duper helpful.
And then the thing that I would add to that is, if you're putting up a portfolio piece, I really love it if there's also a little bit of a kind of artist brief of, here's what I was trying to do with this, here's why, here's what I was interested in achieving, these are the choices I made, and being able to talk about that kind of thing and speak about it in an interview is actually a really good sign of how well you're going to be able to communicate with the team later about what you're doing and why you're making the choices that you're making in a larger game, and that's really critical. And then as you go into those situations, the other thing is kind of developing your career over time. being really conscious of, okay, I'm on a new team. We're doing something that plays to some of my strengths and in some ways doesn't. Like there are some things that this project is demanding of me that I'm not the best at or that are new to me. And be really conscious about your learning. Like what can I get out of doing this project? What can I learn and improve? What does this project have to offer me? Who on this team is going to be teaching me those things? Be really open to that. And that will kind of naturally grow you and your career in a direction that is not only continues to be useful and continues to be employable, has good relationships with your colleagues as well, but is kind of following and exploring new possibilities you might not have thought of at the outset.
So I'm just going to really quickly add, also know what you don't like to do, and don't feel like you are forced to show so much versatility in your portfolio. If you don't like horror, don't have horror samples. You don't have to do that.
Thank you.
Hello. So speaking of writers not liking to do things, so I work with a multimedia team that includes a lot of people who've come from legacy media like film and television and prose, and in some cases, very limited experience to interactive media as either creators or players. And I was wondering if you could speak to sort of any advice as far as like onboarding people into that world with, respect for their talent while sort of, helping them understand the ways in which this medium works, especially if for whatever reason they're not necessarily interested in, playing games themselves. Thank you.
I'll jump in. I think one of the things that's probably going to be the most helpful is, getting these people that you're working with used to the idea that in video games, the first thing that players are going to do is try and break your story. Like, they don't respect you, they're not showing up for you, may not even know your name. So, and I'm guilty of that too, right? You pick up a controller, you're running around this crafted environment, and you're trying to like, okay, where are the seams, where are the breaks, where are the fractures? So, like, knowing that the way a writer operates in this medium is vastly different than other mediums, right? Where they might be the one in the seat of power. That's not the case. But there's also a lot of freedom in that because you can world build in games in ways that are very different, right? Like player agency is the main differentiator in this form of writing, and like everything else is subordinate to that. But like I said, you can then learn to write in different ways.
Yeah. I sometimes find it helpful to actually kind of like briefly present a small project, like here's a small interactive plot or something, some piece that I've worked on before or something along those lines. It kind of gives me an opportunity to walk them through, here's where we're leaning on some kind of gameplay system, here's where we're using some variables, here's where the plot is branching a bit. And because I'm speaking to, my artistic process and what I was doing and why, it hopefully, I haven't been on the receiving end of this, but hopefully does not feel condescending, right? I'm not sort of saying, well, let me tell you about variables, buckle up. But, it's something where it kind of like steps them through all of those elements in a way that they might then be able to start to think about, all right, well, how does this map against what I do? What looks different? And then that leads into a kind of Q&A and conversation kind of process of, all right, what are we going to do with that? Like, what bits of this resonate with me and seem like they would be really cool? Which bits do I still not understand? And so on.
I definitely recommend either trying to play or if like the team isn't like all in person, maybe watching streams of games that are similar to the ones you're going for, because I think one of the most important things is like being able to see the whole experience of a game, not just the writing, like what's the music like, what's the environment like, what's the camera focusing on, and seeing how those people like focus and see, oh, I noticed this, I noticed that, to see like this is how you can slowly shift them into writing to games. And it'll also help showing, okay, they noticed a lot of stuff about the camera work, so writing a lot of that would be really helpful for the project.
Here's a really weird idea that just popped into my head. Play an escape room together. Let them interact in the space, see like all the different variables of what people are doing. After you're done, come together, analyze what happened, because a lot of that sense of play and freedom is what players will be doing in games, and they'll probably have fun, and maybe it'll give them a little bit more insight into what players are experiencing in games.
I have a follow-up to that because that's a great idea. I like to, when I meet people who don't play video games but are really interested in stories, I'm going to use my dad as an example. He's 74. He doesn't know what Pac-Man is. And if I'm speaking to him and I'm trying to explain to him what I do, he loves The Sopranos. And so I go, well, you know, what if you could play as Tony Soprano? And he's like, well, that sounds fun. And so if you're talking to people, right, like, so if you're talking to people who, like, do engage in media, you can ask them, like, well, what would you want to do if you were the main character in that? And they will have answers. Like, I assure you, they will answer so fast. And that's a way that you can get them invested and be like, well, there is a game where you can do that. It's called GTA 5. Like, that's how I would get people who, you know, may not be interested, because I'm sure that there's something out there that they would like.
We are at the 5-minute mark, so what we're going to do is like a speed run and try to get in as many people as possible if we can get like one person to answer. So we'll start with you.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for the panel. It's been amazing. My question was about, as somebody who writes mostly, or at least enjoys writing a lot of queer-focused fiction, I'm curious how when you sort of are in teams, you stay unapologetic in your writing, and any strategies that you employ to like sort of maintain the confidence in your writing.
So let me repeat the question. You're writing queer stories specifically?
Yeah, I enjoy writing a lot of queer-focused stories, and I find that when I work in teams, sometimes I feel like I have to hold myself back. So I'm sort of curious if there's any strategies that you all employ to sort of stay unapologetic even when you're on teams.
So as another queer games writer, one of the most important things is like maybe you want to pull aside and lead and ensure that you feel comfortable telling the stories that you want to tell, because you're going to be limiting yourself if you don't feel that you can tell the full story that you do and show like your full capabilities. So maybe it's reaching out to a league, maybe like setting up a separate meeting to explain, hey, this is the story I pulled from a lot of personal things. This is something important to me, so that way it can be handled with care.
Yes, thank you so much.
Hi. So when you're working with teams of multiple disciplines, especially with non-designers or non-writers, what are the most common sources of friction or misunderstanding, and how have you overcome them?
Sources of friction between different disciplines, is that what I heard?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think understanding scope is probably the biggest one, right? As writers, we just can come up with an idea, with words, with plot lines. Knowing what it takes to actually implement those ideas and plot lines and what all else like is crucial, you know? Like, hey, you just wrote down a new boss character is going to face down our hero in this arena. Guess what? How long does it take to design a boss character? It could be weeks, months, years. Like, if you don't know that, then you're actively harming your other team members and collaborators in terms of their workflows, right? So, like, knowing what it takes to implement your ideas foundationally is a key component of learning how to collaborate across different disciplines.
There you go.
Okay, so one thing I've heard TV writers say is always take the job, always take the money, because when you're starting out, what you really need on your resume is something on your resume. Is there any condition where you would say maybe you don't like a game, or you think a game would badly represent, like you don't like the theme, or you don't think it represents what you want to do, where you wouldn't take the job? If you are offered a job, what's the reason you might turn it down? Or would you always just take the money?
I can do this as someone who's worked on some hot mess games. I think the most important thing is less about like the content of the game specifically, but more in looking like, how has this team functioned previously? Have they created a game before? Have they created a game before outside of just a demo? Do they know how to market it? Do they know how to get everything ready for launch? So I think with content, that's more of like a personal preference, but the most important thing is to see, is this team functional? And is this something that I want to be stuck with in case it doesn't work out at first, or do I want to look for another job that may be a better fit?
Gotcha, thank you.
Hello. First, thanks. You guys are all amazing. This is wonderful. As someone who is transitioning from another industry adjacent, from theater and journalism, also a fellow recovering journalist, how would you suggest somebody think about their portfolio if they haven't shipped a game? There's a fair amount of transferable skills. What do you wish people would put into their portfolios or think about them if they're not coming from another game writing job?
I think two things. One, if I'm a hiring manager and looking at a portfolio, I want it to be really easy for me to identify and access the material that you personally worked on, whatever that is. And if that's a piece of a game, fine. If it's not, if it's something else, I want that to be, don't make it difficult for me to get to. Don't make it difficult for me to understand what it is. And then again, if you, either within the portfolio with an author's note or an artist's note, or in your cover letter or in some other fashion, help to communicate, what was I doing here? How do I feel that my skills are demonstrated in this piece, and how is that relevant to the project that I'm applying to? Is it like I'm working in a game with a particular setting and I've worked on films in that setting before? Is it I'm really interested in the gameplay of this in the following way, and I feel like that hooks up with something I did on a TV program? Anything like that that gives me a route into understanding where you're coming from and how much you know about games and how much you know about the kinds of things that I need on this particular game is very helpful.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Hi there. So how do you have any advice for how to create an interesting or compelling narrative whenever you're working within a genre that normally doesn't have a very strong narrative, like a fighting game or a shoot 'em up?
Yeah, you have a massive possibility space there, right? You can subvert or defy expectations there, depending on the genre, and all these genres are waiting to be filled up with different textures, right? So what is the expectation when you boot up a fighting game and you select your character and you're fighting off? Well, are there going to be taunts? Am I going to yell out the name of my move? What are the things how the character is going to communicate who they are to you, right? And then you can either play to those expectations or defy them, right? So, if a character says something about, his freaking stock price instead of a taunt to you, hey, that tells me something else, right? The thing about all these genres is that they all have kind of contemporary canonical expectations about how, okay, it's a fighting game, so I'm going to get this. You don't have to play by those rules, right? You should know them so you can figure out which ones you should stick to or not. But there's opportunity to mold the genre to your storytelling goals, and not necessarily vice versa. I hope that makes sense.
It does. Thank you.
You're welcome.
It is now 1 o'clock. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions, but we will be hanging around. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Again, please fill out your evaluations and have a wonderful rest of your DDC. Thanks for being here.